This is Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers, with your hosts, Mike Thorne
and Miriam Riche.
Craftwork is recorded and produced in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River.
The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nickel Schroeder. Jean Marc Ah-Sen is the author of Grand Menteur in the Beggarly style of Imitation and Kilworthy Tanner. His writing has appeared in McSweeney's Quarterly Concern, Literary Hub, Catapult, The Comics Journal, Maclean's The Walrus, and elsewhere.
First of all, thanks so much for making the time to come on our podcast. I read Kilworthy Tanner, just finished it last week, I think, so yeah.
When people say that they've read Kilworthy, I never know what the reaction is because they tend to be pretty extreme, and for some reason people will often assume that something you write is your life wholesale. And I think with that book in particular, for some reason, people seem to attribute that with my whole life, I guess, because there was that kind of autofictive frame. Like I remember I was at a reading once, someone just came up to me and said, "You're a freak," and they left. And that's all. I was like, I never said this, this is how I think about the world. I just thought it was an interesting lens to write from. So when people say, "Oh, I read your book," I never know what that means.
I think that being called a freak, I don't know, it doesn't sound like they meant it as a compliment, but I think that's a compliment. So, I mean, we've talked about this on our podcast before, like, you're probably talking about writers and non-writers alike, but as a writer, I never assumed that, it didn't even occur to me that it would be, like, autobiographical, so didn't even occur to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's better if people think that. So I think that's good.
We always like to ask our guests at the top, what were some of the books that first got you excited about reading or writing? What were your first literary loves? Are there any books that have always haunted you or stuck around in your brain since childhood or adolescence?
Yeah, so I remember as a kid, I think my mom would leave me in the North York Public Library, and typically I'd be reading French or European comics, and she would do grocery shopping. So my first introduction to literature was actually bande dessinée. So there's a lot of Asterix, there was a lot of Tintin, Quick et Fluke. So comics was always present in my life, and then as I went into adolescence, I would always gravitate, to like Karl Barks and Donald Duck. So that was my introduction. And I thought for the majority of my teenage life that I would be an illustrator or a comic artist. Like that's the trajectory I was trying to do. But when I realized that I was either too lazy or couldn't resolve the inconsistencies in my line work, it occurred to me that someone has to write these things. So I was trying to get into comics, trying to make comics. And the biggest influence at the time was Grant Morrison, who's a Scottish comic writer, and they just kind of blew the doors down in terms of what I thought had been possible in literature. And I was also reading a lot of science fiction at the time, so H.G. Wells, Philip K. Dick, which is something that I've not really gone back to. But yeah, so once I kind of even abandoned comics, I guess the big literature stuff that had left a big influence on me, or at least made me think it was possible to pursue this as a career or a métier, would have been Edith Sitwell, Thomas Pynchon, Tobias Smollett. And then I started getting to like diaspora fiction, like Sam Selvin and G.V. Dasani. So those are all high literary offerings. Another big one was Flann O'Brien. Flann O'Brien was really instrumental as a teenager to kind of make me realize that was the kind of literary tradition that I wanted to be a part of.
That's so interesting to segue from one medium to another. I can relate. I do ceramics, but I felt a certain, I guess you said laziness. I felt a certain laziness, like where I don't feel it about writing. Like I didn't really want to improve my skills past a certain point. Do you still draw? I know in like Kilworthy Tanner, for example, there was like kind of a mixture of different mediums, like music and playing music and collaborating on music. Obviously, most of the time comics are a collaborative process. I'm just wondering how you feel about kind of the distinction between writing and drawing.
Yeah, I don't draw, to answer your question. I stopped in my late 20s, so it's been well over a decade since I've done any drawing of any kind. But to go to your collaboration question, I did come from comics and zines, and I was in bands. And for me, it's like when you're in a room with other people, even if you're principal songwriter and you've kind of made the structure of the song, you still need everyone to participate and help broaden out the scope of what you're working on. And I think about certain art making traditions that are entirely predicated on that, like hip hop and sampling. And when I entered publishing, there was always this obsession with the singular voice, or the voice that could be attributed to a lone author. But then there was also this tension because you'd have books that were being ghostwritten, clearly. I mean, I think growing up, people were like, "Oh yeah, R.L. Stine. There's no way he writes those books. He's got like a Warholian factory of writers, and I'm sure he does like a polish at some point." But that wasn't a knock to me. I thought that was amazing. That was pretty cool concept. So I feel that a lot of my writing practice is informed by that, by bringing people in and citing other people who are or have contiguous practices that align with yours. So it never felt alien to me, but I think that there is that resistance within the industry, even though we have certain models for collaborative writing, like whether it's a musician writing a memoir, or I think about my friend Andrew Sullivan, who had a book come out called The Handyman Method with, I think, Simon & Schuster, and that's 2 authors. So I feel like maybe that hold or that packaging branding problem of 2 writers is maybe loosening a bit, but that's certainly something that I like to carry with me, and I like working with other people. I love flipping the script on what a book can be, and questions of attribution are usually foremost in my mind, and I think that's reflected in my Kilworthy and in some of my other writing.
In a 2022 interview, you said you were often advised growing up that, quote, in order to produce objects of aesthetic notice, you had to stop consuming them. Writers only reading nonfiction for the sake of the craft, no fiction ever, painters living in seclusion and away from distraction, that sort of thing, end quote, which struck me as very counterintuitive advice, but that could just be me. I was wondering, I wanted to hear from you if you agree with this advice or how you feel about that advice now.
I think I'm someone who likes to keep it pretty porous, so I'm always consuming stuff. At some point, there's a filtration process, so I kind of try to winnow down what the influences I'm going to be working with. And usually, like when I start a project, I know what the basic parameters are. I have this book that's coming out with my friend Andre Babin, and we wrote 2 halves of the book. But for me, I remember writing my half. I was like, oh, like I really love Patricia Highsmith and George Simenon, and I was wondering if I can kind of mash together Talented Mr. Ripley with Striptease, and at least I had kind of broad guardrails. So for me, I'm always thinking about what is the text in conversation with. I find that very helpful, but I also think that kind of not absorbing influence, it's something that I've heard a lot of. Like I remember corresponding with Momus, a musician and writer, who was a huge deal for me, and he was like, I don't consume anything like new, really. My writing is like a dialogic process between very, very strict traditions, and so he doesn't, for example, read, I think, anything contemporary. So I think it depends on your process. Maybe one day I'll get there, but I feel like so much of my time, I feel, is trying to play catch up and read things I haven't read. So I don't think I'll ever stop doing that. But I think for me, certainly, I wear my influences quite liberally on my sleeve.
Okay, wonderful. That actually segues really well with the question I have for you here. I really like what you had to say in Miramichi Readers, Why I Wrote This Book, in which you were referring to your contribution to dead writers. To quote you, you say, I've come around to the position that you just have to let your influences redefine what you think is possible in your discipline, or convince you that questions of feasibility aren't altogether important to begin with, just as long as you are being pushed to be responsive in some way. So that kind of ties in with what you're saying about, I guess, anxieties of influence. I'm in the same camp as you. I certainly, when I write, I feel as though I need to read things to not forget how to, like sometimes I just don't really know how to construct a sentence and I need to see it done. But you've talked a little bit about books you read growing up. And I know that in this Miramichi Reader piece, you were talking about Camus, who I also really like. But anyways, I just wanted to give you a chance to respond to that quote of yours.
I think I was thinking about writer's block because I remember having this conversation with my friend Andre Forget, and we were talking about like how do you get past writer's block, and if writer's block is actually a thing. And I think that in one sense it's a discipline problem because I used to have a really bad discipline problem, like procrastinated, didn't write anything all the time. And then at some point, the pandemic, I was laid off, and I was finally given the opportunity to try to straighten out that discipline problem. And I wrote every day. And whether it's good or not, that is kind of neither here nor there. It's just, it's something that you have to incorporate on the daily schedule. And I think with regard to writer's block, Andre and I were kind of came to the conclusion that part of the problem, if you solve the discipline problem and you're still having issues writing, there's a kind of numbness that happens. And whether that's just because of information overload or too many stimuli, you have to remain responsive to all the things going on. There's always something interesting happening. Sometimes you have to dig a little deeper to find it. But how, as writers or creatives, can you remain, what's the word, amenable to receiving, the information that can be translated into literature, if that's like your discipline? So we were kind of discussing how does one remain open to that. And some people, it's reading the newspaper or staying connected. For me, it would probably be reading Daily Mail comment sections or newspaper comment sections and just feeling this intense revulsion to what is out there. But whatever the avenue, I think part of it is you have to remain open to everything that's there. And if you fall into kind of apathy, or if you fall into a kind of non-responsiveness, that can only impede or harm your process, I think. So that's kind of what we resolved. And part of that is staying curious. And I think that is probably true of relationships, your relationships to people, to art, like to stay curious. If I was when I was studying literature in school, if you were in a really prescribed section, like, I don't know, literature of the 18th or romantic poets, by the end of the year, you would probably never want to read a romantic poet ever again, even though you may have certain affinities with it. So part of, for me, the solution to staying curious is a big breadth like attitude towards literature, which is reading as far and widely as I can. I try to read as much international stuff or stuff in translation. I think that is a very good way to like reset the filter and get you to stay curious and open about what's happening out there.
I saw some strategic dissonance in your new story, Busybody. There's a contrast between Gerald's sort of self-serious narration and the relatively base quotidian scenes, which to me gives the story a comic dimension, but also a compelling kind of tension. So how were you thinking about tone and perspective as you wrote this story?
I often think back to Smollett, who I had mentioned earlier as being one of my main influences, and how his stuff was polyphonic, so he would write from different class lenses. But one thing that I found so humorous was when, because you had like 5 characters depicting a scene from multiple perspectives, and somehow through that like imbrication of class, you would have the landed aristocracy pulling up their servants up to engage with that world, and vice versa. So I always go back to that tradition of like 19th century English literature, where there is a kind of flattening of high and low culture, and those are lessons that I haven't been able to shake for years now. But I always found that so funny that you would have these really base, vulgar situations, but kind of described through the lens of someone who, I don't know, has had a classic philological education, has been to the finest boarding schools. I always found that tension to be quite humorous. In Busybody, I don't think I really give a reason for why Gerald is like that, other than the fact that maybe because of his shame over being ugly or being hard to look at due to various physical ailments, that he probably just retreated into the interior and read books. He likes old movies, like I think I mentioned Dorothy Ardner in there. There's a movie that they watch. So it's just kind of retreat into the interior, and how that sometimes puts him at arm's length with other people, whether it's his roommates or Jacinta, one of the love interests. But really, it's not until he meets Azra that he finally meets someone else who similarly has had to retreat into the interior, that he's able to experience for the first time a real emotional connection based on an actual overlap in their lives. But I think that was kind of unconscious. I don't think I had set out to tonally. I don't often like work that out. It's usually I get get going. And then my main concern is just to make sure that the voice is kind of consistent throughout a story.
That's really interesting, the idea of like kind of working through tone. I'm always curious to pick other writers' brains regarding their process in that sense. And I think it's fair to say that you've got a panache for coining unusual sounding writing techniques. I guess coining, but also referring to. In Kilworthy Tanner, you brought some up that I think one was from Chaucer. Some seem to be very self-made. And as we were saying earlier, I know that I did not take it to be a autobiographical work, but some of these did seem kind of like things that maybe you use in real life. I've got a list of them here. We've got draft sacking, silly cutting, and I don't know how to pronounce it, tuiering. And I'm wondering, are these things like that you actually use? And yeah, like maybe you could just describe them to our listeners, because I found them quite fascinating.
Yeah, no, I don't use that terminology at all in my life. Neither do my friends. I think a lot of my friends, who most of which are writers, we all kind of have that. Our ears are always kind of tuned to like the musicality of language, and I think a lot of us maybe started out as doing poetry, and I think we that never, whether or not we're poets now, we never shook that affinity for the musicality or the timbre of a phrase. And I think that people who are really in the weeds about words and stuff and who like those things will often think about words, think about etymologies for a really long time. For me, I just have I have a writing app on my phone, which I think is just called Writer Plus or something, and I just keep a note of last names or names that I find funny, or that it's just something that resonates on a musical level. And I don't know if that comes from my background in music, but it's just kind of like in the same way that you have a chord progression that might sound novel to you. I usually just keep a list of things. I have a list of like the next 20 books titles in my mind already, and I just it just goes into a repository. And I think that's where things like draft stacking and tiering and I can't remember what the other one was, but yeah, I think that's where that comes from. It's from a notebook somewhere. But no, I don't. None of my friends really talk about that. I think we have our patter, which maybe comes out in the dialogue sometimes. But other than that, no, we don't. I think part of it is that high literary style I find amusing, because in real life, when you meet someone who speaks like that, it's kind of insufferable. But I think there's something kind of funny about it and precious about people who, I guess, they're so invested in language because that's how they see and understand the world. And there's kind of that high culture, low culture thing that we were kind of talking about that I find verbose people funny. And even though I count myself, I guess, partially among that group, I think it's kind of making fun of yourself in a sense. But I don't believe that I act or talk in the same way that my characters do. I just think if there's one takeaway, I think, from my books that I hope from like the 5 readers that I have, it's my sense of humor on display. Like those are the things that I find funny, whether it's the situations or the kind of like aggrieved arrogance that comes out in certain social situations. That's what I find funny. So I feel like that's the main thing that my books telegraph to readers.
Okay, I was actually asking, but I mean, I obviously had a curiosity about how far-reaching, etymologically speaking, your vocabulary is in your writing. Obviously, we are talking to you right now. You're not speaking like a character in your novel, but those ones I actually picked because they were referring to, I can't remember, silly cutting, the one that you couldn't remember. Let me see if I can remember this, but it's like a specific technique for writing, I suppose, like taking a person from real life and creating almost like a caricature of them. I thought that these were like things that you did. I didn't for a second think that you would say something. I mean, I don't know. We don't know you, so maybe you do say draft sacking and tuiering in real life. I thought maybe you were like injecting certain craft techniques into it. I suppose I stand corrected.
I think we all kind of, not that, the Canadian literary landscape is particularly, it's people aren't prone to suing people, but I think we all pull from our social circle, and there are certain things that you encounter that find their way and slip their way into your writing, certain situations that have a sense of immediacy in your life that you want to write about and respond to. But yeah, writers can be really gossipy and bitchy, and those are the writers that I like. And, just it's just fun to sit in the corner of some watering hole and talk about who's got the worst, who got like the most undeserving advance, who got the most over deserving advance, and why those books are selling. I think we're all kind of really nervous and anxious and self-conscious about this industry because there's such small resources available, and the failures feel larger than they are, the successes feel larger than they are, but we're all kind of very, very nervous about going out in the world with a new project. And I think that's part of what Kilworthy was talking about, what happens in like art cultures when there's no money in the industry. There's a sense that the next generation is coming up and breathing down your neck, and it's almost like the walls are closing in on you. And I think that makes people behave in very funny ways, in cantankerous ways, and problematic ways. And the book was just meant to be reflective of that. Like I don't find publishing that fun from like a business end, but you do it for the love of the craft, and that was something that hopefully comes through in the book, that it's somebody who's trying to struggle with this over-metricized moment in literature where it seems like the last thing that people are thinking about are what the book is actually about, or what it's trying to say about whether a moral question or a literary question or whatever it's trying to really communicate to a readership. There's like a million other things that come before that as considerations of whether or not it should be published. So that, I think, those are some of the frustrations that are baked into the novel.
Well, as you were speaking about those dynamics between writers at various stages, various levels of success, and so on, it brought to mind some things I noted again about Busybody. I saw like a constantly, sometimes subtly shifting power dynamic in that story, particularly between Gerald and Jens, but it also manifests elsewhere. And I was curious if you consciously designed the story's plot around power negotiations. Was power at the front of your mind as you wrote this story, or was that something that materialized organically, or maybe you disagree with my reading? Maybe power isn't something you see at play in that piece.
No, I think that's spot on. Like, I think I wanted to play with how intoxicating power is, and how you can get drunk on it. And I think the differentials of power that we're talking are very low stakes in my story, but it's just for anyone who's living that kind of situation where you're being surveilled. I think it's super claustrophobic and stress inducing, but for those people, it's their whole life, really. And these little moments of power transfer, I guess it's like a domino effect. You have one person who's clearly abusing someone else's inferior status in a kind of social hierarchy. But in that relationship, there's like a model for how power can be used. And Gerald does the same thing to his roommates by spying on them. But then he's put into a situation with a romantic partner, Azra, who, even though there is a power dynamic, it's also kind of a liberating power. Like, she's more willing to share power with Gerald. And that's not something that Jens really does. There's a woman that comes between them that obviously is another form of exploitation, I think, that's suggested in the story, but there's no sharing. It's not real sharing. It's a very mercenary approach to getting what someone wants. So it was something that I wanted to explore, but how, there are types of that kind of power transfer among individuals there's a kind that's really pernicious and soul destroying, and there's a kind that kind of like maybe plays into empowering, and if that, as long as there's a kind of like pendulum swinging, that exchange of power. I think there's like some sort of Kantian idea about that when he was talking about, I think he was talking specifically about heterosexual relationships, but I think it could apply to any relationship, but how that kind of pendulum swing is a way to reach actual balance, like between a partnership where people kind of oscillate between who directs and who leads, like in a dance, which I find quite beautiful as a metaphor.
Yeah, and it also connects to something else I identified in the story. These are maybe interrelated ideas, but they also could be kind of spoken about separately. But Busybody also depicts control in some compelling ways. Like, in some sense, Gerald is a kind of uniquely passive protagonist throughout much of the story. throughout a lot of it, he doesn't necessarily have much control over his own body, and he often cedes to the pressures and demands of both Jens and Azra later on. This also relates to control. Were you also consciously thinking about character agency within the space of this story?
I think so. I think I wanted to show that if your model or criterion for agency is a flawed one, as in the case with Jens, when you start to take control of your life a bit, you're probably going to recapitulate that model of power. So I'm thinking about that scene where Gerald smashes a painting in the art gallery a photograph of him in an art gallery that Azra clearly doesn't want smashed. She doesn't want her subject in the gallery. That's just a boundary that she has. But he doesn't know how to express agency other than the way he's been shown by Jens's actions. So it's like, for him, agency isn't just doing what you want to do, it's hurting someone. And it's making someone feel uncomfortable in the same way that he felt uncomfortable surveilling his roommates for Jens's own reasoning. So I think I just wanted to explore that, how it's almost like in the same way how certain traumas get, shared down over generations. If that's your only model for feeling good about yourself or conceptualizing happiness, your model is going to be flawed. It's going to be behavior and actions that serve to make your life more unbalanced than actually being on the straight and narrow.
As you're speaking about the kind of characters and thematics in Busybody, it is bringing up some thoughts regarding Kilworthy Tanner. It's another work in which questions of social hierarchy and kind of mercenary behavior in a publishing industry and power dynamics and kind of clout and how it shifts and reversals of fortune. And so I'm just curious, I always like to know if writers have any kind of recurring fixations, could be themes, archetypes, emotions. Is there anything that you find yourself coming to time and again?
Yeah, I have to think about that. I think that I'm someone whose process is largely a mystery to them. So I don't, I think that each time I set out to do something, I don't really know what direction I'm going in or careening in. And sometimes, your own personal pet subjects find themselves into a work, but I think I'm just responding to things at the moment, things that I've read or things that are happening in my life. But you have to have a kind of very sincere, for me, a sincere connection to the subject. So I wouldn't, for example, see that, I don't know, genre fiction is really in right now. It's getting, in terms of the major publishers, they're really embracing genre fiction in a way that I never thought would have been possible. And it's not to say that I would never do a genre work, but I wouldn't attempt to write something just because something is popular. There has to be some sort of sincere connection, I actually love the form of the detective novel, so I'm going to try to do that. So as long as it's, for my own personal definition, an authentic relationship to something, I'll go headlong into it. But in terms of recurring things, yeah, I don't know that I have anything definitive that I feel like I have to say. Maybe in part I've ceded so much of that control to my collaborators because I feel like it's really fun. It's actually funner to work with someone else's own machinations and what they're interested in writing and responding to that. So that's what I find so liberating about working with other people. But I feel like the books that are attributed just to me are pretty representative of my life to a degree. Not everything, obviously, but in terms of my sense of humor or subjects that I find interesting, that's there. But I haven't thought about solo work in so long. I don't know if that's a bit of a cop-out, but I don't know what those pet subjects would be other than things I find funny.
That's a novel approach. I don't think I've ever met a writer who is, I'm not saying this would be your fixation, but you seem very interested in form. Maybe the content isn't as recurring, but something we keep talking about, Kilworthy Tanner, and I thought it was an interesting, kind of a tour de force in, is it metatextuality? Is that the word?
Mm-hmm.
So you have it's a quote unquote pseudo biography. It's got a playlist of pseudo bands who are real bands in real life, but they have pseudo names for the purpose of the text. There's a pseudo hotline at the back of the text. When I was reading it, and it's funny, when I read your piece in Dead Writers, let's see if I can get the title right. Praise, Dissection, Discussion, Doubt. When I read it, yeah, it reminded me of Nabokov. And then when I read Kilworthy Tanner, it kind of reminded me of like Ada or Ardor or like Catherine Lacey's Biography of X. But there's something maybe with the former, whereas like Kilworthy Tanner it's set in Toronto and there's maybe a little bit of Montreal, but it's kind of like an alternate universe. Like it's mimetic, but it's also kind of like fantastical, and you do all these kind of strange and interesting things with metatextuality. So I'm just curious, like, where you draw your inspiration from, if these ideas just occur to you, like if you're just like, you said you're interested in comics, it makes me think of like, I don't know, I read Asterix and Obelix and Tintin when I was younger, and there's this sense of like world building and immersing yourself in a text that's a little more multidimensional. But yeah, I'd be very curious because I haven't talked to many writers who have this approach.
Yeah, so for Dead Writers, for my contribution, praise, dissection, discussion, doubt, I really loved Camus' The Fall. So that's where the narration style comes from, and trying to pin what his occupation is. In The Fall, he's a judge. And for me, I don't think it's a spoiler, but ostensibly the main character is a journalist, but she's actually the devil. She's the devil who's come to Earth to play, iniquitous tricks on the local denizens of that small French town. But yeah, that kind of came out. I wanted to do something as a love letter to Camus in The Fall specifically. And once I pinpointed, because I became obsessed with all these devil narratives in literature, I thought about what the devil would read. And it struck me that he would probably love Stephen Potter, who's a British writer that I liked, a post-war writer, who just wrote these like satires about, he's most known for his gamesmanship books, which were kind of making fun of self-help books. It was bad advice in self-help form about how to cheat in life, how to get ahead, how to basically press every advantage at your disposal to find love, make money, win games. And I was like, oh, that's exactly what the devil would love. So that line, praise, dissection, discussion, doubt, is actually wholesale taken from Potter. So again, going back to what I'd said, I find these like little guardrails that I want to write about. So Camus and Potter, and then I kind of let those parameters dictate how the form and the content and the plot will derive from those things. For Kilworthy, I had a similar thing because I was actually obsessed with music biographies or autobiographies, and some of my favorites were Dee Ramone's Lobotomy, Richard Hell's I Dreamed I Was a Clean Tramp. There's some other stuff that I'd been reading, but I also came across in memoir, there was like a good guy memoir, which was about someone who's writing ostensibly to score settle, but likes to come across as a good guy. I did everything in my power to help people. I was a good moral actor in my scene. And I thought that would be kind of an interesting lens to write from. So someone who constantly portrays himself as not having agency in his life, to not be accountable for some of the disastrous things he's actually part of. And I don't think Jono is a reliable narrator for that reason. But that was kind of the lens that I wanted to work from, because I thought that was an interesting perspective that I had encountered before, but it obviously was not reflective of how I would approach it. I also became obsessed with the quote-unquote revenge novel, and I often talk about Hanif Kureishi's Intimacy, which was largely a very, very mean-spirited, lampoon of his ex-wife. And it details his decision to basically walk out on his family and his two boys. And that caused a minor uproar in England at the time, because his wife was in publishing, and everyone in publishing kind of knew it was about her. I think Kureishi's sister disowned him from the family, like saying, "I can't believe you did this to her and our family. Like, it's vile. It's airing out dirty laundry." You know, you read a book and then you get caught up in how it's in its reception in the public, and that becomes almost like part of the reading experience. And so I wanted to have those elements kind of baked into the book, so you could, and that's another reason why, like, putatively the identity of Jono is me, but it, you know, like that was part of the built-in narrative. If you were aware of that genre of fiction, I think you would see that I was just tipping my hat to that, and that kind of world building would extend. And that's why there's so much time spent talking about how people, like the secondary and tertiary characters of that scene, view that core group of writers in that book. And I just thought that was just a very interesting, like raw matter to want to play with.
I wanted to return to something you mentioned much earlier in our interview. You talked about the influence of H.G. Wells when you were a kid. And it's interesting because I just within the past year have gone back to H.G. Wells, who also really excited me as a kid. And The Island of Dr. Moreau and The Time Machine are both like stunning novels, in my opinion. I mean, there's so much we could say about them, but I guess I wanted to ask you if can you see any residue of science fiction in your work, or is science fiction a space you're interested in exploring as a writer?
Yeah, I actually am. So my main writing partner right now is Paige Cooper, who's a speculative writer. She's my favorite writer of my age group, like I guess millennial writer. So when we started working together, we had like a wish list of things we wanted to write about, and I would say Paige's feet are more firmly in that world. So a lot of this foray into science fiction is more on account of her than my own incipient like reading habits as a kid. But she wanted to write about the Zamazamas, who were South African. I don't know if they were brigands, but they were kind of like illegally mining, and basically they would go cave diving and deal in rare earth mineral extraction on the black market. And this was in tandem with, official big corporate entities who were doing the same thing. But basically the Zamazamas would live underground for weeks. A lot of people never came back. So she really wanted to do something about subterranean subcultures and rare earth extraction. And once I started thinking about that, I became a little obsessed with the hypothetical room temperature superconductor. So that is what we are currently working on, which is this big sprawling 3-book thing. The wells will come out, I think, in that text. So that's something that we've been working on that for 4 years, and I think it's going to be excerpted in McSweeney's The Quarterly Concern in a couple of months. So that'll be the first. When that's out, we'll see how people respond to that sci-fi type of thing. But that's certainly in Paige's wheelhouse more than mine.
Since you keep mentioning these collaborations, I'm curious, Mike and I wrote a short story together this year. It's coming out in November, and it was an interesting exercise. We'd like to try it again, but it's just like there's so many different ways to do it. And I'm curious, like with you and Paige working on this thing, do you like write different scenes from one another? Like how do you manage that work of collaborating on something as it's not like music, or obviously you can only kind of do it one at a time. So I just love to hear more about that.
This is only my second time really doing this. Like the first time I did it with Andre Babin, and that was more of a call and response thing where I wrote 20,000 words and I said, hey, if you wrote a response to this and solved a lot of the dangling plot lines that I left for you, it would make a really cool book. And that one was very collaborative because we would have these meetings and talk about where we thought the story would go or things that I could do to tighten up linkages in his part. But that was more separate in the sense that we kind of were left to our own devices and then did a polish. Paige and our process is much more labor intensive, where once a week we go into a Word document and we take turns writing paragraphs. And basically when one person gets tired, we're like, okay, your turn. And then the agreement is when we're not in a writing session, we both have carte blanche to rewrite anything without asking the other person. So we've rewritten this text, I don't know how many times, at least 10 times. That is not just to produce a singular narrative voice. It's also to defamiliarize the text for us, which is what makes it so interesting. And we're now at a point where we don't often remember who wrote what. And, I might ask Paige, like, what were you thinking with this event here? And she'll say, you wrote it. I don't know. Or we'll misremember. So that's also part of the fun. And then, figuring out in between writing sessions where we think this should go, if this is not quite working, or if one of us minds if we rewrite the other person's part. So that takes a lot of trust. And I think you really have to put your ego in the back. But I think it works for us because we're very similar in our writing styles. and we come from a very similar place in terms of like inspiration and stuff like that, and we're very much on the same page, and there's no ego about it. So I think with the right individual, like hopefully you and Mike can continue in your collaborations, but for me it's one of the most rewarding and satisfying experiences in my writing life that I've ever been a part of.
I'm always interested to hear writers' experiences with early mentors or people who provided advice in some sense. Is there a piece of writing advice that you received at maybe an early stage in your career, maybe later, that really stuck with you for better or for worse?
Yeah, there was I'm untrained, I should mention. I've never set foot in a creative writing class. I did study literature for an undergrad, but that was we talked about, form and content, but there was no actual craft advice. So I do consider myself untrained. I think one of the things that on a practical level, that was really helpful was I read somewhere that a good way to get your toes wet is to find like a piece of writing you love or a writer and just type out a page verbatim and just get a feel for the rhythm, the syntax, the flow, how things are working. That was an early exercise that I did, like I'm talking like 14, 15. That was pretty helpful. And then after that, I think it's kind of like aesthetic related, partially business related, but there's always like this pressure to break through or to cross over. And what are the things that you will need to do so? And usually that involves you retooling your approach to your writing or making it more accessible or writing about things that are topical. Those are the things that I think tend to get thrown your way. And I've had a lot of great mentor experiences, and the one consistent thing that I've heard from them, and these are people who I were heroes to me, they've all said, your North Star shouldn't be anything but the creative path you're on. So forget about the business advice that you get. Just write what seems authentic to you, what you're interested in. And if you're lucky, maybe the culture catches on or you make a little bit of money and grind out some profit at some point. But really, that's not the business that you're in. You can't take a stockbroker's approach or a mutual fund approach to the arts. So instead, what you should focus on is how to stay healthy, how to stay disciplined, how to take care of yourself, or what you need to keep going and keep giving everything of your life to this industry. So yeah, everyone in my life was a mentor figure is mostly still there. I mean, one person was Ulysses Castellanos, who was a performance artist who I met through Darren McDonald's mammalian diving reflex, which was kind of half like art happening, half performance art piece where they would get on a stage at a theater, which typically was Buddies in Bad Times, and they would just riff on stage and bring the audience in to have a dialogue. And we used to go to Franz after, right? Like, and I would hang out with these performance artists, and that was really helpful because Ulysses was like 20 years older than me. I was 18, and he was talking to me about like Dada and performance art. And it was amazing. It was amazing to have someone look at you as an equal or be curious about your life. That was really helpful. And then I started hanging out with Paul Pope, he's a comic artist from New York. Paul was my hero growing up, and now we're friends. But just through that friendship, through telling me like how the business used to be in publishing or things you have to watch out for to stay hungry. Like he used to say, stay humble, but stay hungry. And that's something that I always think about. So just, keep your head in the areas that are actually important to make sure you're in a good mental space to produce. And if that is on the agenda, that you're a lifer, that you want to be doing this till you can't anymore, then you need to figure out the things you're going to need, whether it's a side job. I bartended for a really long time. Just do whatever it takes to be materially safe and happy, and then figure out your art process. And then, yeah, a lot of other people are still in my life. Marta Balsevich, Adam Hammond, they've really been helpful. Paige, Andre, all my collaborators, they've all been really great. And part of me wanting to do those anthologies was I could get free writing advice. Like I didn't have to enroll in an MFA. I had kids very early, so it was always just, make money. And I didn't have time to go back to school. But hanging out with all these writers who had done that largely was so helpful because, this is an equal exchange, right? It's not like no money is trading hands. We're just sitting in a bar talking. And that was really helpful to kind of forge this own community or enter a community that pre-existed, because a lot of those relationships were already there and then they just kind of coalesce organically. I'm not taking credit for putting these people together. It really is. We were all friends. So I think that those things, an artistic community, figuring out how this can be sustainable, and I don't mean that from a financial perspective, although that's also great, but those two things are very important. I feel that a lot of people who are interested in publishing aren't really interested about book culture. They're interested in getting famous, and that's why they become comedians for 1 year, or they become actors another year. And I'm not saying that to denigrate those fields, but there's a lot of that in literature. And then if you hold on to the people who actually love literature, I think that everyone just rises up together. I think that's also a good thing, to not try to be strategic in your social relations. But there is that kind of pressure because, as I said, the resources are so limited, and I'm not getting any younger, and there's a new crop of writers who are coming behind you, and you're always like kind of worried, like, because I've seen this happen with my older friends where the door of opportunity just closes or they get dropped by their agents. And these are all things you got to be thinking about just so you can keep going. But those are the things that I would say. Those are the good pieces of advice that I got.
Well, that's all very inspiring. There's a lot of great advice, and I'm all about free writing advice. Part of the reason why we do this podcast is we'd like to think of it as a repository for writers of all levels of experience to glean helpful tips from writers. Also, I find reading craft books is a relatively cheap way to improve your writing skills. As you were talking about writing advice and just this idea of just kind of chasing your own North Star, something that gets in the way for me as a writer is the reader, the imaginary reader, imaginary audience. So I just thought it would be apropos to ask you a question about that. Are you conscious of the reader while you write? And if so, do you find it helpful or is it distracting?
I don't for my literary stuff, because I'm that reader. I'm the ideal reader. I'm just trying to amuse myself. I've often taken a very cavalier approach to how I'm read, and I mean, there's more than enough Goodreads stuff and reviews that just slag my stuff for that reason. That's fine. I find it funny that they are that invested. So I don't. But I think whenever I'm doing newspaper or magazine stuff, obviously those editors are they're amazing at their jobs, and they have to keep their readers in mind. So that's where I'm more responsive to that input, because you have to, you get it. As I said, everything's metricized. So one article doesn't get as much hits. They try to figure out why. Maybe it's how I was writing, and that's fine. I'm happy to do that as a freelancer. And yeah, that stuff I usually never push back on. For me, I treat it as a big learning experience, because it's a different audience. It's a much bigger audience. And clarity, I think, more than anything, is what they're looking for, because anything that impedes the speed at which something is consumed is viewed as a hurdle, and rightfully so. I think for literature, I think you can have a little more leeway and place obstacles on purpose in the text, which is something that I like to do. But yeah, I think it depends on the audience. So in that respect, I am cognizant of the different understandings of readership. But yeah, for my own personal stuff, it's usually purely aesthetic concerns, I would say, which is not to say that I haven't thought about writing a commercial thriller now and then.
So when you're talking about this process of writing to amuse yourself, which I actually also think is sage advice, I think the element of fun and play should be present. I don't want to say should, because there are always exceptions to any piece of advice. I'm sure for some writers, the process is very punishing and difficult, and they produce phenomenal work. Doubtlessly, there are many where that's the case. But for me, fun and play are very important. As you're speaking about your process, I was wondering, do you tend to plot in advance? Are you more of a quote unquote pantser? Does it vary from project to project?
It varies. I've always been aware of structure and plot, because a part of my, formal education in university was I did study film. And a lot of the genre stuff comes up. So, conflict resolution, 3-act structure. One thing that comes to mind is I believe it might have been Bakhtin or one of the Russian writers who was talking about Tolstoy. And there were all these pictographs of how they structure novels. And one thing was they called it stair-step construction for Tolstoy. So if you imagine like stairs going up, then horizontally, then vertically, then horizontally, every vertical deviation was a way for Tolstoy to deepen characterization. But plot-wise, not much happened. You might be at a ball for 50 pages, right, in War and Peace. But that deepened the relationship among characters and clarified the stakes. Then when you would speed across horizontally, that's like plot information. So whether it's like, okay, we're switching scene or we're jumping into the future, so-and-so has died, so-and-so has got married, that was a way for readers to kind of, in a very timely way, get caught up but still have a relationship to the stakes in these lives. So that stuff I'm aware of. I don't know to what degree I think about those things. It really does depend. But to answer your question, yes, I've learned to outline. Sometimes it's a little more free flowing. And to bring up an example for my book with Paige, we're almost done the first book. We just need an ending. So what Paige did was she wrote me a plot ending and was like, here are the things that need to happen. You write it. And then she'll take a pass after it, and then we'll be done. And then meanwhile, she's working on our second book, right? So it's sometimes that is helpful to you. And I've thought about different ways that narrative or narrative structure or a plot can be helpful. I wrote this short story in my second book in the Beggarly style of Imitation. It was written from a prompt because my friend was putting together a commemorative magazine issue of celebrating Austin Clarke. Austin Clarke had just died. And I remember thinking the way that I wanted to engage with Clarke was I wanted to take one of his short stories and identify what were the main kernel of a plot, and that's the only thing that I would reuse. So that same plot, an eviction, and the consideration of why someone has a political awakening or not were the two things that happened in my story. And I thought that was amazing. It was an amazing prompt to get, like to basically be like engaged with Clarke in some way. And I thought, why don't I just write this tribute or mirror story or a cover story where the plot is exactly the same, but everything else is different. So depending on the situation, I will have a very clear understanding of what needs to happen and how I need to get there.
I find with all of our guests, there's always some kind of little thing that I feel like I can learn. And I love this staircase thing. Thank you for, because I was commenting to Mike and my father. I mean, I love Anna Karenina. It's a great book. And, you know, you were talking about having a background in film. I don't have a background in film, but I often do try to think of things that happen in film that you could kind of try to import to writing. And I mean, I love like Hitchcock. I love set pieces. And I always felt that you said like 50 pages of a ball. Like that's what I really liked about Tolstoy was these kind of like set pieces where things are deepening. So I'm definitely going to keep this kind of like staircase, vertical, horizontal dynamic in mind. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we've come to our final question. So we always like to ask our guests, have you read anything memorable recently?
Yeah. What have I read? I actually have a list of every book that I've read. So maybe if I pull that up, that'll kind of stir my memory. I'm reading a book called Anti-Blue. It's a Stephen Potter book, which I mentioned. I really like Stephen Potter, but that's his ironic self-help guide to finding romance in life. That's really funny. It's really arch, and it's really salacious and funny, and plays up the many kind of insecurities that are at work when you are courting. So Anti-Woo has been really good. What else have I been reading? I started reading The Dying Animal, which has been on my radar for many years. And, the debate has been long standing as to whether or not Philip Roth was celebrating his lifestyle of being promiscuous and dating his students, or whether he was really making fun of that picture of a professor, figure of authority who has no sense of awareness of what he is. So I've been reading that with that lens in mind, and I have been enjoying it, regardless of where the hammer falls on that question. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like those are the only titles that I've read recently. I don't often read for pleasure anymore because of my assignment load. I did really love Maria Rava's Endling, which is just got nominated for the Writers' Trust Award, and I think that's an incredible piece of fiction. And I love how it, there's probably a version of that novel which is a straight page-turning, big five novel with great creative flourishes and subtle and avant-garde flourishes, but I sense that for her, the minute that the Russian invasion of Ukraine happens, it implodes her understanding of what literature is meant for. And that novel is so great as a testament about how literature will always fail in encapsulating real events, real geopolitical events. So it's just funny. Like, she puts her Canada Council art grant questionnaire application is in the middle of the book, and it talks about her struggling to deal with this real event based on this novel that you're writing. But the first 100 pages you read is like this by the book, by the numbers, albeit very good, narrative-driven novel that you never ever go back to, because the war is so big, and her family is there, and she's just struggling with the reality. I think it's her grandfather or her uncle who refuses to leave his home, and she's waiting to hear the news that he's died or the building's been bombed. And that book, that really stuck with me, because it just seemed like such a great testament to what we do and what it matters, or a crisis of conscience, I guess you could say, of, can you keep writing after a traumatic event?
Yeah, those all sound terrific. I have not read any of them, so some recommendations for our listeners. Before we forget, I just wanted to ask, is there anything you would like to plug before we go?
I guess just the 2 or 3 things that I have coming. Now I Shall Leave You to Your Fate, which is my collaborative book with Fawn Parker, Liz Harmer, and Sophie McCreish, is out, I believe, in early November. We're going to be launching at Flying Books on College in Toronto on November 24th. All are welcome. I have, as I mentioned, I think it's McSweeney's issue 81 maybe, or 82. We'll have a story from Paige Cooper and I. That's in the Quarterly Concern early next year. And then in the fall of next year, my collaborative novel with Andre Babin, Slow Death Land 66, is out with Great Plains.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Fascinating conversation. We're really grateful to you for taking the time. And it's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having me.